Hello. This is the 25th Sunday of the year. And this particular year, 2018, that falls on September 23rd. And this will be the readings, a little bit of a exegesis of it, and a little bit of a commentary and homily on it. So the first reading today is from the Book of Wisdom. Now, remember always, the Book of Wisdom, even though it's not found in Protestant Bibles, was very often used by early Christians because it's probably one of the earliest biblical books that gives belief in an afterlife. And so this particular passage brings up that dimension of somebody's life that they can live beyond this particular life. The wicked say, "Let us beset the just one, because he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doings, reproaches us for transgressions of the law, and charges us with violations of our training. Let us see whether his words are true. Let us find out what will happen to him. For if the just one be the child of God, God will defend him and deliver him from the hand of his foes. With revilement and torture let us put the just one to the test, that we may have proof of his gentleness and try his patience. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to his own words, God will take care of him." Pardon me. The word of the Lord. The second reading is again from the letter of James and brings up something that we're all familiar with. Just the other day in the college course I teach, we were talking about the Cain and Abel story from the book of Genesis. And one of the reasons the sacred author put that particular passage in there was to show that sin really is down deep inside of us. Cain and Abel's parents, Adam and Eve, needed some exterior force, the snake, to tempt them to sin. When Cain kills his brother Abel, he comes up with this idea on his own. We basically have evil inherent in us on different levels, and the author of James is, in a sense, trying to deal with that particular phenomenon. Beloved, where jealousy and selfish ambition insist, there is disorder and every foul practice. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without inconstancy or insincerity. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. Where do the wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? You covet, but do not possess. You kill and envy, but you cannot obtain. You fight and wage war. You do not possess because you do not ask. You ask but do not receive, because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your passions. The word of the Lord. And the gospel, as I promised last week, is this second cycle of Jesus predicting his passion, death, resurrection, there being a misunderstanding, and the third element, always, he gives a clarification of what it means to die with him. In this particular passage, the misunderstanding is implicit. Jesus will refer to it, and it's a misunderstanding that most of us can identify with. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples, telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men. They will kill him, and 3 days after his death the Son of Man will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capharnaum, and once inside the house he began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. The Gospel of the Lord. As I mentioned last week, early Christians really wanted to get to the heart of what it means to imitate Jesus. And they realized the simplicity, as I said last week, of Christianity. It's very simple. If you die with Jesus, you rise with Jesus. It's not very complicated. The only complicated part is, how do you die with Jesus? And last week we saw the first part of that particular dying with Jesus from chapter 8 of Mark, and that had to do with simply being open to whatever God asked you to do by carrying your towel, remember? This week, that gets even more deeply embedded in followers of Jesus. How do you die? And you start this particular passage, which Jesus making the prediction again, as he does all the way down the line. And then the misunderstanding Jesus refers to when he says, what were you arguing about on the road? Obviously, his followers, including, if not excluding anybody else except the 12, were arguing about who's the head high honcho, who's the most important member of this particular group of individuals. And Jesus basically says, you can't operate that way. If you're going to follow me, you have to have this world, in some sense, turned upside down. You have to look at this world from a dimension that most people never even notice. You have to take the most helpless, the most inefficient individual in the community and realize that person's importance. And he has an Exhibit A here, a little audio visual to demonstrate this. He pulls a kid over to him. And in that culture, unlike our own culture, kids were not that significant, at least on the level they are today. They are simply kids, that's all. And he says, you have to accept a child as being one of the most important persons in the community. Please, after this particular gospel, if you happen to be at a liturgy in a church that has a cry room, you have my permission to basically destroy the cry room. Jesus tells us there shouldn't be special places for kids in church. You should simply tolerate the interruptions that they give because kids are important. Of course, try to convince other people in your parish of Jesus' particular message here. But what Jesus is saying is, basically, if you're going to be my disciple, everybody in the community becomes an important individual. And in some way, that author of wisdom is saying, even the just person in the community, the person who has the proper relationships with individuals, is important in a community that doesn't value his particular otherness. We don't necessarily want proper relationships with everybody in the community. We'd much rather have ourselves as the important person, and the only relationship should be how people treat us, the individual who's important in the community, over and against everybody else. And even James, talking to Christians, is saying, you really screw things up. Please, I think sometimes we read these particular summaries at the beginning of Acts of the Apostles in which everybody gets along hunky-dory. There's no difficulties here, no problems over there. Everybody tries to better each one in giving themselves to others, even living what we would today call probably a communist, more socialist type of existence. Frank Cleary used to always say, read some parts of James, read some parts of 1 Corinthians 11, for instance, and he would say, that's not the community you find in the Acts of the Apostles. This, what I just read this morning or today from James, is much more what reality was with different communities. There were problems in them. You had some people who wanted to, again, like Jesus stressed with his disciples, to be better than somebody else. You had insignificant people in there, people who just didn't count for very much. And James attacks that frame of mind to say, if you're going to be Christians, if you're going to be other Christ, you have to imitate Jesus, especially his faith, his mentality. You have to kind of fulfill the dreams Jesus had, when he came here to exercise his earthly ministry, because we're carrying on that ministry. So by our understanding of other people, especially in the Christian community, we have to give an example to others of what Jesus had in mind. And we don't always find this. I just read an article last week that said something that I have insisted on for years, that the problems in the church weren't that Vatican II came and that disrupted everything. The problems that we have today in the church is we didn't consistently follow Vatican II. We basically gave up on it after a couple of years. That's why this year, for instance, our diocese is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Southern Illinois Association of Priests. One of the reasons in the late 60s I was instrumental in helping found SIAP was because I thought that particular group of priests, small as it was, could carry on these reforms from Vatican II, at least in the priesthood. Even if the universal church had kind of given up on them and soft-pedaled them, and by the time John Paul became Pope, basically ditched them. We have to realize if we didn't follow those reforms, neither in many ways were we following the dream or the message or the plan of Jesus. Charlie Rooney, a seminary classmate from the North American, mentioned to me once, he was from Detroit, and Charlie mentioned that Cardinal Dearden at a clergy conference shortly after Vatican II asked the priest of Detroit a question. Considering, as Dearden said, that we can't make monsignors anymore due to the council, how do I have a way of expressing my gratitude to certain priests who have gone far above and beyond what ordinary priests do? I wouldn't dare make him a monsignor. That, according to Dearden, had been outlawed by Vatican II. Well, sure in the heck isn't outlawed. We got monsignors all over the place again. Just if you have a monsignor in your parish, that's a sign we have not followed Vatican II, certainly haven't followed Jesus' teaching. I always remember when my pastor was named a monsignor, I guess I was maybe in college seminary or so. And my mother had known this pastor since she converted to Catholicism in 1938. And I said, well, it's a shame because he's certainly not going to be as effective in dealing with people as he would have been before when he was just Father so-and-so. And my mother assured me, Monsignor so-and-so will never change. I will never have any problems going to him with my difficulties or anything. I've known him practically my whole life. About 3 or 4 years later, she confided in me. When he was named a Monsignor, that really changed everything. I no longer felt worthy to go to him with my particular problems or difficulties. It was like he was far too important to take care of me or be interested in my problems. I think one of the reasons Jesus said what he said today in that gospel about that child and accepting that child is, if we don't have equality in ministry, if we don't have equality in the Christian community, we're not going to be able to be ourselves. We're always going to be worried about what somebody more important thinks or what somebody more important does. We have to look at everybody as more than equal. Pope Francis, especially in the last couple of weeks, has really been pounding away at clericalism due to this sexual abuse problem that's overwhelming our church. And in a way, Francis is saying that's the number one problem. If these priests didn't think they were ontologically different, or the bishops didn't regard themselves as being ontologically different, a lot of these abuses would never have gotten to the point where they are today or where they were 20, 30 years ago. I think Jesus kind of realized 2,000 years ago how to avoid problems that we're experiencing today. The council, back 50-some years ago, understood this message of Jesus, really appreciated, in a sense, what's in today's gospel, and said we have to somehow or another go back to that. Now, obviously, we got sidetracked, or the official church got sidetracked shortly after Vatican II, and we went back to business as usual again, having a stratified community and not following logically the development or the evolution that Jesus or the council expected to happen. Fortunately, we have a Pope who says, I think we better go back and continue doing what we stopped doing shortly after Vatican II, to become the Church of Jesus, to accept the mentality of Jesus. That's the second way of dying with Jesus, by having everyone as one in the community. I mentioned in my commentary this week, my written one, that if Jesus were among us today physically as he was during his historical ministry, he might not take a child and put him in the midst of his disciples. He might go into a nursing home, go into the room of an Alzheimer's patient and say, when you accept this particular individual, somebody who doesn't even know what you're doing for them, somebody who doesn't even recognize you, somebody who 5 minutes after you leave will forget you're there, and you regard that person as another Christ, as God among us, as the risen Jesus in our midst, then you understand what I'm about. And Jesus basically marks Jesus as saying, that's a real death to do that. And yet that's the death that we followers, we other Christ, are called upon to imitate. Just a little practical problem. We have to wait till the 29th Sunday, 4 more weeks, before we get to the third way of dying with Jesus. So kind of hang loose till then. We have a little other stuff to talk about and other readings to explore, but eventually we'll get to it. Thank you very much.